I'm going to talk this morning about how I build a rifle, taking a squared stock blank. This is a rifle stock blank. This is normally what you see size-wise when you get a blank from the various suppliers of high-grade gun stock wood. This is a English walnut blank. I basically drawn with a black marker here a rough outline stock. I'll take this to the bandsaw and saw this out right to the line. I've drawn a line on the very top of the stock blank, an inch from the right side of the blank. This is for a right-hand rifle with a cheek piece. Most stock blanks are somewhere around 2 3/8 to about 2.5 inches thick. This is what's required to build a stock with a cheek piece. Anyway, I do those various aspects once I've got that all sawed out. Then I determine where I want my front guard screw hole. The front guard screw is this screw here. I determine where I want that. I'll take that blank over to the milling machine. I'll set it up in the mill vise in the milling machine. I'll drill a hole from top to bottom, the stock blank. That's where everything has to start. Basically, that hole was used as a guide. I run a headless screw into the bottom of the action. You can set then the action down up on top of the stock blank, and it gives you an idea of the location and everything. And I'll roughly lay out with a marking pen on the top portion of the stock blank the outline of that action. I'll measure the action with calipers and carefully lay this all out. A rough idea where this barrel action is going to set in the stock blank. I'll take the stock blank, put it in the milling machine, use a milling cutter, and I'll mill out what is the square portion of the bottom of the action. This happens to be a rifle that I built from a blank. This is a 7mm by 404 Wapiti Express cartridge that I designed. This is a rifle that I built from a blank piece of wood. This piece of wood here happens to be also English walnut. It's exhibition quality English walnut. This is a double square bridge Magnum Mauser action that I've used to build this particular rifle. I'll explain more about the rifle after I've detailed some more things to do with the stock. The bottom of a Mauser action is flat, has a square on it. You mark out those widths, your tang, shape, and everything. Mill all that all out of the wood. The next thing is, once you've done that, you can set your barreled action on top of here, lay out the contour of the barrel on the piece of wood, give you a rough idea of where that barrel is going to set. That portion for the barrel, this happens to be an octagon barrel, so I've got a special milling cutter that I've made to use for cutting octagon shape in the wood. You got to understand that I'm only roughly cutting this. I'm cutting it undersize from what it is, because the rest of it I've got to cut away carefully with chisels. This is a selection of chisels that I have here that I've used for 50 some years to build rifle stocks for inletting and so forth. I've got flat chisels. I've got gouges, various sizes, scrapers. When we get down to the final detail of inletting, you change from the gouges to scrapers and so forth. I've got rasps. Of course, use that in a round area to kind of get things kind of straight if you got just a little bit off. This piece of wood should cut very cleanly because it's fairly straight grained. It's a straight grained piece of English walnut. And turn the metal upside down, and you use basically an oil paint called Prussian blue. You take that and squirt some onto a paintbrush, and you rub the bottom of your barrel action, everything that's going to contact wood, with Prussian blue. And as you set this barrel action down, it leaves an imprint on the wood, areas that you need to relieve, you need to cut. And you always need to have an outline of everything that's fairly close so that you don't cut more wood than you want to, because then you're going to have a gap, and that's the last thing you want is a gap. And so it'll take me, half a day to mill this stuff out to my satisfaction. It'll take me probably another full day or more to hand inlet that barrel action down into the stock blank. Of course, the stock blank has to be inletted for your trigger guard bottom metal. That's done the same way. You basically measure everything and transfer those measurements onto your stock blank to be able to inlet for your trigger guard floor plate assembly. So take the stock blank, turn it upside down in the milling machine, and carefully route out with a mill cutter the areas that need to be cut away to accept the trigger guard floor plate assembly, making close measurements and always having a rough outline to go by so that you don't accidentally mill past where you need to. Once you get that, you start fitting that bottom metal down into the bottom of the stock, and you do this with chisels. The array of chisels that I have here are used to be able to do that. Once you get all that set, for instance, you need to inlet that trigger guard floor plate assembly down to within about 20 or 30 thousandths of contacting the bottom of the action. You want just a little gap between the bottom metal, your floor plate trigger guard assembly, and your barrel action. When you screw everything together, then it's not going to be metal against metal. You're actually, metal against wood. There's a faint distance in between so that everything tightens up in that way. You've got all those things all inletted. The next thing that I would do, I would cut my stock blank off at whatever length I like from the front of the action to the end of the forend. I like 10.5 inches. Some people may happen to like a different distance. That's what I've picked. I use ebony for a forend tip. This is ebony. I'll have to cut off my blank the required amount. The ebony tip is about an inch and a half long, and so I'll cut the blank off the required length to when I have attached this ebony tip onto the stock. I have basically a piece of angle that's been cut. Lay that on the end of the stock, centered up with this top line. This hole will center up with the mark I've got just marked on here. I can clamp this on here. I can use a drill bit. I can drill using that hole as a guide in this angle to drill for a dowel pin. I'll drill that about an inch deep in here. I'll do the same thing with the forend tip. Then I can take a piece of wooden dowel, the proper length, just slightly shy of 2 inches, and I can slide these all together and make sure everything fits. Then that forend tip is epoxied on to the end of the stock blank, And the next thing that I do, I square off the bottom of the grip here in the milling machine, and I'll use a grip cap. I'll take a grip cap. This happens to be a steel grip cap here. This happens to be a Jerry Fisher steel grip cap. I like to use those, or Leonard Brownell steel grip caps. I'll mark everything and lay everything out. Screw the grip cap to the bottom of the grip here to protect things. And the next thing I like to do, I like to square off the butt to the proper length here for the length of pole. So with the barreled action basically just laid on the side of the stock with the trigger in it, I'll mark basically where the trigger position is going to be here, and I want about 3 5/8 inches from the point of the grip to the center of the trigger is about where I want. That's called grip pull. I'll mark that line on the stock. I'll measure there back, 12.5 inches for a 13.5 inch pole, because the recoil pad is 1 inch thick. I'll mark it. I'll saw that off with the bandsaw. I'll take it to the sander and I'll sand it perfectly square, and then I'll screw my recoil pad onto the buttstock. Now I've got everything all in place, and once I've done that, everything's all inletted. The barrel action's inletted, the bottom metal's inletted, the fore-end tip been epoxied on here, the recoil pad's been screwed on. We're going to have a cheek piece, and I'll take my marking pen and I'll draw on the side of the stock here a rough outline of this cheek piece. You can see the cheek piece here is outlined. This is the basic shape of cheek piece that I use to fit your face and so forth. And I've got all those things basically done. And once I've got that done, we're going to have to take a fair amount of wood off the left hand side of this blank. Right back to right at about the grip. So I'll draw another line on the bottom side of the stock blank here on the left hand side, because I'm going to take this blank over to the saw and I'm going to saw this roughly, somewhere about 3/8 of an inch off the left hand side of this blank, right back to about the grip. We stop right there because basically we've got to have that extra thickness here allowed for the cheek piece. I'll take it to the sander and I'll sand that true. We need to all the time work off of a perfectly squared blank so that everything comes out properly, so that things aren't, positioned in the wrong position, the wrong angles and so forth. That gets us to that point. And then now we've got everything sawed off here that we can saw, but from there I go to different tools, and I'll use straight chisels, I'll use gouges, and I'll mark what I want to be about the finished outside dimension. A stock isn't, when it's finished, it's rounded. So I've got to mark, from the edge of the metal outward to be able to get an idea of how much wood I want beyond the metal. On both sides of the barreled action, on the bottom in relationship to the trigger guard, and everything basically is thicker here in the middle. It tapers down narrower towards the fore end for your fore end. All that wood that's there needs to be all cut away, and this is done with a hand saw, sawing at angles on the blank, and then a chisel and a rawhide mallet, and I'll start chipping and cutting this wood all the way from this blank. And within about 6 or 7 hours, I'll have this stock completely carved out with chisels, with gouges. I'll have the cheek piece all carved out here. I'll have everything all cut away on the left hand side of the butt beyond the cheek piece for the proper thickness, and basically working on a radius. I've got in my mind's eye exactly what this stock is supposed to be. I cut everything away from this squared blank that is not going to be the finished stock. Once I've got that all basically rough shape, I use various rasps, big heavy rasps. I rasp wood away, really takes the wood off quickly. I've got finer rasps that I'll use along the line, such as this rounded. It's round on one side, it's flat on the other side. I'll go over that rough rasp of wood, smooth that out with a finer rasp, and all the time feeling everything. You know, my whole grip is shaped, the whole stock is shaped, feeling it with my hand and measuring it. I like to measure around the radius of the grip. I want that grip to have about a 4 5/8 inch diameter, roughly that 4 5/8 diameter around the grip. When I talk about around the grip, I mean right around this portion of the grip. Use a flexible tape to run all the way around here and see what my diameter is, so everything's right. And everything, of course, a rifle stock is either a straight line or it's a radius. There's no other shapes to a rifle stock other than straight lines or radiuses. It all has to flow together. You know, the cheek piece, everything is radiused. This is a sculpted cheek piece. This has got a beadline border and so forth. That all has to be filed in there, cut with chisels and filed in there with a rust rasp and finish rasp, and then sanded. I use something as this DeWalt sander to do a lot of sanding, or sanding blocks such as this sanding block, starting with 60 grit paper and progressing down as I get everything finished and so forth. Sand clear down to 400 grit paper, you see. And then once you get to that point and you're satisfied with everything with 400 grit paper, I take a damp rag, wet rag, and wring it out, dampen the whole stock down. That raises up what they call whiskers on the piece of wood. You let that dry, then you come back with 400 grit paper and you sand those rough whiskers that are sticking up. That grain's been raised. You sand that all off. You do that 2 times, and each time you let it dry for 15-20 minutes or so those whiskers raise up. Then you got a good, clean, smooth piece of wood that's just as clean and shiny as can be, and it's all ready for you know, a penetrating oil, a good quality stock finish that will penetrate into the wood to considerable depth, repeatedly, you know, soaking that stock with that finish till it won't soak it up anymore. And when it won't soak it up anymore, I come back over it with, you know, 400 grit paper again that's been dipped in that stock finishing oil, and roughly, you know, lightly sand that stock all over, so if there's any imperfections and so forth, that those things are all taken care of. And now the pores have been filled with repeated applications of this oil and so forth, and we're ready to put the final finish on. You know, slather the stock fairly good with your stock finish and rub it in by hand. rub that in by hand. That's what's called a hand-rubbed oil finished stock. That, you know, you might have to put 30 coats or so on this stock to be able to finish it. And if there's anything that looks like it's uneven, you stop right there and lightly sand that with the 400 grit paper and oil. Work that all out, and until everything is just perfect and it shines like this oil finished blank here does. It's got a, you know, this is what would be described as like a London oil finish. It's got just a dull sheen to it. It's nice and smooth. And once you've achieved all your aspects of finishing the stock with oil finish, now it's time to, you know, to checker the stock. And I've got a cradle that I mount this stock in, and I'll lay everything out on the bottom center line of the stock to each side. Same way the bottom center line of the grip, the top line of the grip, and so forth. Laying this out with the proper angles for the checkering pattern. And checkering is done in a 3-to-1 ratio. In other words, the diamond is 3.5 times, about 3.5 times longer than it is wide. You get all that laid out. You basically file with a you know, a layout tool the line into the stock to start your checkering from both ways. This way around the stock, and you basically progress until all these things match, and you've got a finished checkering pattern. The same way on the grip. This is a 2-panel. This is a wrap-around checkering pattern on the forend. This particular stock, 2-panel, and this is also described as a multi-point pattern. In other words, there's multi-points that form the actual finished pattern of the checkering. This is, I think, one of the sharpest looking aspects of checkering is the multi-point pattern. I also do fleur-de-lis patterns and actually multi-point checkering patterns with fleur-de-lis. I also do those. Those are considerably more time consuming and so forth. And that basically is the rundown on how a wood stock's built. You know, once you've got your wood stock all completely built, it's all finished, you need to go to your metal and finish fine polishing all your metal, because you never finish your metal completely before you build your rifle and put the barrel action down into the stock. The last final little bit of polish to the metal, because it's impossible to build the rifle with, for instance, a blued barrel action without marring something. You get that all polished. Now it's all ready to blue. You blue it, you put it all, everything all together, you screw it all together for your finished rifle.